When you hear Bing Crosby Productions, what comes to mind? Musicals? Hogan's Heroes? How about a movie where a social outcast trains rats to get revenge? In the early 1970s, Bing Crosby Productions wanted to branch out into different genres, so they picked up the rights to the 1969 novel Ratman's Notebooks, with the intention of adapting it to film. Like the name of the book implies, the story is told through a series of journal entries. The author is telling the story of how he's this socially awkward guy who befriends a colony of rats that he trains to get revenge on people who have been mean to him. The adaptation changed a few things. It was no longer told in first person, and they gave the main character a name, Willard. They hired director Daniel Mann to helm the project. Mann was an enthusiastic director who'd been making films since the 50s. However, he was an odd choice to direct since he'd had no prior horror experience. He wanted the movie to be an intimate character study with a healthy dose of dark humor injected throughout. For the main character of Willard, a 19-year-old Bruce Davidson auditioned for the role. Davidson was still new to the industry, with his first film being Last Summer in 1969. He auditioned for the film using a scene from later in the script. The director was impressed and took him to the second part of the interview, the garage of Mo DeCesso, where he met his co-stars, hundreds of rats. DeCesso was the rat handler for the movie. He took one of the rats, about the size of a rabbit, and placed it on Davidson's shoulder. Davidson wasn't fazed. The rat sniffed him, and after a minute, the director said, "Your co-star likes you. You got the part." Since the movie was going to be a character study, the director hired numerous character actors for the rest of the cast. He hired Elsa Lanchester to play Willard's mother. She starred in everything from Mary Poppins to Murder by Death, but is probably best known as the Bride of Frankenstein. Ernest Borgnine was hired to play Willard's crooked boss, Al Martin. Borgnine was a little worried after working with the rats after some scenes he had to do in 1969's The Wild Bunch. Sandra Locke was hired to play the love interest Joan. This was also very early in her career, being her third film. The film was announced as The Ratman's Notebooks, but the studio decided to change the name to Willard. The film was relatively low budget, so they shot as much as they could on location rather than building sets. The main location for the Styles house was a mansion that was in Los Angeles, California. It became a very popular place to film over the years. Everything from Waxwork to Witchboard to a Halloween episode of Beverly Hills 90210. The interiors were all shot inside the mansion. The backyard was also the real backyard of the building. The only place in the mansion that was a set was the basement. They built it so they'd be able to contain the rats without any of them escaping. Filming began in mid-1970. The shoot was long, and they often filmed 14 to 15-hour days. This was largely because, as they discovered, you can't train rats. They were able to coerce them by smearing large quantities of peanut butter wherever they wanted them to go. Even still, the rats often didn't do what they wanted, so most scenes involving rats ended up being anywhere from 30 to 40 takes to get it right. As a way to give himself a little energy boost, Davidson kept a pocket full of M&Ms and would eat a few if he felt run down. One day he took a handful and popped them into his mouth. Only one wasn't an M&M, but instead it was rat poop. Since the rats were so unpredictable, Davidson had to improvise what he was doing with them most of the time. He'd wait for the rats to do their thing, and then would just act around them. Channeling the dark comedic nature of the film, Davidson played the character like an 8-year-old. The scene where he walks out of the house after a failed birthday party, his hat gets stuck in the tree. This wasn't planned, but the director loved it, so they left it in. Davidson saw the film as a live-action cartoon, but felt they weren't going dark enough with the story. The director wanted to keep it more of a dark comedy that switches to a full-on horror film in the last 15 minutes. The two main rats, Ben and Socrates, were played by a few different rats, although there was one Ben that was used most of the time. Davidson became friends with the rat, and often sat him on his shoulder while he had lunch. The ASPCA was on set to make sure the rats weren't harmed, so in scenes where it was possible for them to be hurt, they used fake rats. The rat noises were all added in post. Davidson and Locke hit it off during filming, and dated for a brief time. Davidson became friends with Borgnine over the shoot. He gave him some tips on acting, and the two got along well. Except for one scene. When Willard's confronting Al, he's swinging a metal rod. Davidson accidentally hit Borgnine with it. The veteran actor was so angry, he grabbed the pole and swung it back, nearly hitting him. This was also something that wasn't scripted, but the director loved it, so he kept it in. To get the rats to attack Al, they covered the actor in peanut butter and let them go to town. He was okay, until one of them ran up his pant leg. He wasn't too happy with that. For the big finale, Willard's killed by the rats. They were afraid of something happening to the actor and messing up the film, so they saved this as the last shot for the film. They built an enclosure to keep in the rats. They smeared Davidson with the all-purpose peanut butter and had him lay in the enclosure. They then dumped buckets of rats on him. He said he wasn't hurt, it was just weird. After filming, Davidson left to shoot his next film, the dramatic action thriller The Jerusalem File in Israel. The marketing department was worried the film wouldn't appeal to women. At the time, college revolution and hippie films were popular, so the studio marketed it as a youth movie. Willard was released on June 18, 1971, and was a surprise hit. It went over better than anyone expected, and ended up being one of the most successful films of the year. The writer who played Ben was awarded what was essentially a Best Actor Oscar for Animals. To the studio's surprise, the movie ended up being a big hit with women. For a few years after the release, rats became a very popular pet at pet stores. When Davidson returned from Israel, he was stunned to see what Willard had become. The movie was so popular, the studio fast-tracked a sequel, Ben, which was released the following year. Since we never see Willard die at the end of the movie, Davidson pitched the idea where he'd be roaming in the sewers in New York, badly scarred and commanding his rat army to do his bidding. Kind of like Quasimodo with rats. The studio decided to not bring Davidson back, but instead focus on their new rising star, Ben. Within the film is the song Ben, performed by Lee Montgomery. For the end credits, it was performed by Michael Jackson, and the single hit #1 on the pop charts. It would later win a Golden Globe for Best Original Song, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song. There was a popular line in Willard when he's sending the rats to attack Al. Tear 'em up! They later sold Willard and Ben as the Tear 'em Up double feature. With the overwhelming success of Willard, other killer animal films were greenlit. Stanley, about a killer snake, Phase 4, about killer ants, and even the highest-grossing film of all time at the time, Jaws. The movie also influenced social outcast movies like 1976's Carrie. Willard being such a hit proved detrimental to Davidson at the time. He was hoping to do more art films, but all he was being offered was roles as villains or killer animal movies. He was typecast as the weird kid, and it took him a long time before he was able to get out of that. He joked in Willard that he kissed a rat on screen, and because of that, it was 15 long years before he was able to kiss a female co-star. Davidson remembered what one of his co-stars told him. He said not to be the leading man, to be a character actor. A good character actor is never without work. He took that advice, and now Davidson's one of the best-known character actors with over 250 credits to his name, from blockbusters like X-Men to TV shows like Hunter. While the big line in the film is, "Tear 'em up!" Stephen King met Bruce Davidson and told him his favorite line was this:
I thought a lot about it, hating myself. Well, I like myself now.
Years later, he cast him as Dr. Stegman in Kingdom Hospital. Within the show, he had him say a variation of the line. Sandra Locke directed her first film, Rat Boy, in 1986. While partially an homage to Willard, the story was quite different. It was about a deformed boy who looked like a rat and lived in a garbage dump. The elderly woman with the mechanical chair in Gremlins was an homage to Willard's mother. Willard was a big hit on home video, but then something unfortunate happened. Over the years, the movie changed hands, and it got to a point where no one was sure who owned the rights. It never made it to DVD, and VHS copies were rare. While Davidson had been in hundreds of movies, the #1 question he was always asked was what happened to Willard. In the early 2000s, New Line Cinema bought the rights to remake the film, and in 2003, we got Willard, starring Crispin Glover. While it did well with the critics, it failed at the box office, making only $7 million out of its $20 million budget. Davidson appeared in the remake as a picture of Willard's father. Even with the remake out, the rights to the original were still in limbo. Finally, in 2017, almost 50 years after the film was released, the rights issues were worked out and Scream Factory released the film on Blu-ray. Davidson was overjoyed that this lost film would finally be able to be seen by a whole new generation. Willard's a terrific dark comedy thriller with a heavy emphasis on character. While most would dismiss this as nothing more than some rat-infested horror film, it's really more about a socially awkward man's descent into madness. While it's a sad tale of a young man trying to gain control over his own life, it's also a very humorous dark comedy. Davidson's outstanding in the lead role, Locke is great as the emotional support, and Borgnine is fantastic as the scumbag boss. However, beyond all that, the most important thing is that this was a movie about killer rats, where they introduced a cat into the film, and the cat didn't die. That's gotta be a cinematic first.
Do you mind holding this?